I thought I was just being a concerned wife, but my husband's secret hotel visits led to him sleeping in the guest room for days. Me, 34F, and my husband, 35M, have been married 5 years and together for 9. From the start, I totally felt like I won the boyfriend odd husband lottery, because he's definitely out of my league. He's handsome, very fit and athletic, wrestling and boxing and jujitsu, and super charming. I see the way women look at him, and I am very aware of how attractive he is. My husband has never given me any reason to think he has been unfaithful. He's wonderful provider and father to our 2-year-old son. However, about 6 weeks, there was a change in his routine that made me suspicious. My husband is an engineer. Doesn't work crazy long hours, but does bring work home usually. I work part-time from home, 2 or 3 days a week, and we have a spare bedroom that my husband made into a beautiful office. Usually when my husband comes from work, I am done working by the time he comes home, he usually eats something and then finishes up some work, or he goes and works out. However, I do admit kind of pestering him for things while he is working or exercising. If he can reach something for me, move a box, take the trash out, or our son wants to see him and play or be read to. I admit that it is probably very distracting, but he never has indicated to me that it bothered him. So about 6 weeks ago, my husband started to leave for work very early. He always woke up first, made breakfast and coffee, fed our son, and then he would leave when I would wake up. But lately, he would leave for work about an hour earlier. He would make coffee still, but would leave before our son got up. My stupid friends told me he was probably cheating, so they convinced me to sneak into his phone. I looked at his phone while he was in the shower. He doesn't keep it locked. I found nothing, no texts or phone calls, but I did share the location of his phone to mine. Next morning, he leaves early as usual, and I track his phone. Turns out he was going to a hotel. I am livid. I ask my neighbor to watch our son for me and head to the hotel to try and confront him. When I get to parking lot, I can kind of see on my phone that he is on direction of this little restaurant associated with the hotel. It was a little diner, and that's where I found my husband. He was in a booth, by himself, with his laptop doing work and having breakfast. My husband spots me and asks what I am doing there. I felt so relieved and told my husband my suspicions and what my friends told me. My husband hates my friends. I saw how disappointed he looked. He didn't say much to me except, "I can't believe you thought I would do that and that you would trust your dumbass friend over me." He ended up going to work, and I went home and tried to be the best wife ever. I even made dinner for him, which I never do because he is a way better cook. I don't know what to do, though. My husband has been very distant last few days and slept in the guest room past 3 nights, which totally broke me. And today I found out my husband will not come home today. He's staying with a friend. I am totally panicking now. How can I fix this Reddit? Update 1. After the diner incident, things felt incredibly tense between Jake and me. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I found myself replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. I could see how disappointed he was in me, and I realized I had let my fears cloud my judgment. I felt guilty, but I also felt scared. My friend's doubts had crept into my heart and created a rift that I didn't know how to bridge. The following week, I made an effort to reconnect with Jake. I started small, making his favorite coffee in the morning, trying to ease the distance that had grown between us. I wanted to remind him of the love we shared, the laughter, and the joy of our early years together. But every time I reached out, I felt a subtle barrier, like he was hesitant to let me in again. He would smile, but his eyes seemed distant, filled with thoughts I couldn't grasp. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed Jake sitting quietly in the living room, scrolling through his phone. I had been trying to create a comforting atmosphere, candles lit, our son playing happily in the corner. But Jake seemed distracted. I felt a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. When I finally gathered the courage to ask what was on his mind, He simply shrugged and muttered something about work. I could tell there was more to it, but I didn't want to push him further away. That night, after our son went to bed, I decided to go for a walk. I needed to clear my head. As I strolled through the neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I thought about the late night texts, the secretive calls, and my instincts told me there was more to Jake's behavior than he was letting on. I felt a mix of frustration and sadness. Why couldn't he just be open with me? The next day, I confided in Sarah. I told her about the strange vibe in our house and how Jake had become increasingly withdrawn. She listened and offered support, but her eyes flickered with something else, something I couldn't quite place. When I asked if she had noticed anything unusual, she hesitated before saying she had seen Jake at a cafe with a woman a couple of weeks ago. My heart sank, and I felt betrayed, not only by Jake, but also by my friend. I couldn't believe I had allowed my trust in Sarah to blind me to my own husband's actions. The thought of Jake with someone else sent me into a tailspin. I spent the night tossing and turning, my mind racing with possibilities. When morning came, I felt a surge of determination. I needed answers, and I was prepared to confront Jake again. As he left for work, I knew I had to be strong. I would no longer let my insecurities dictate our relationship. After he left, I found myself pacing the living room, waiting for him to come home. My thoughts spiraled into dark corners, imagining him laughing and enjoying time with this woman. I felt a rush of anger, but I also felt sadness creeping in. I wanted to trust him, but the doubts gnawed at me. When Jake finally returned home, I could sense the tension in the air. I decided to take a direct approach. As we sat down for dinner, I brought up my feelings. I expressed my fears and concerns, and to my surprise, he listened intently. He admitted he felt hurt and disappointed, but he also shared that he had been struggling with work and was seeking a sense of fulfillment outside our home. I listened, heart racing, realizing that our lives had become so intertwined in responsibilities that we had forgotten to connect as partners. I proposed that we take a weekend trip together, just the two of us, to rekindle the spark we had lost. Jake seemed intrigued by the idea, but there was still a hesitance in his eyes. However, just as I thought we were making progress, his phone buzzed with a notification. I caught a glimpse of a name I didn't recognize, and my heart sank again. My mind raced with suspicion. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. I didn't want to overreact, but the image of him with another woman flooded my thoughts. I decided to put my trust in him, but the doubts continued to loom over us. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. Jake lay beside me, but it felt like there was a chasm between us. I wanted to bridge that gap, but I didn't know how. I felt lost, unsure of what to do next. Would this weekend trip help us reconnect, or would it simply delay the inevitable confrontation that loomed over us? The tension hung thick in the air, and I knew the answers I sought were still out there, waiting for me. Update 2. The weekend trip was supposed to be our chance to reconnect, but I felt the tension only escalate. We drove for hours, and I watched as Jake stared out the window, lost in thought. I wanted to shake him out of his reverie, to engage him in conversation, but every attempt seemed to bounce off the walls he had built around himself. It was as if he was a million miles away, while I sat right next to him. When we finally arrived at our destination, a quaint little cabin in the woods, I hoped the serene environment would help ease our minds. I tried to make the best of it, preparing dinner and setting the table with candles, but Jake's distracted demeanor only intensified. He barely touched his food, and I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer. I turned to him, and with a trembling voice, I asked what was really going on. To my shock, he finally opened up. He admitted he had been feeling overwhelmed by the pressures of work, feeling like he was losing himself in the routine of life. He didn't want to burden me with his struggles, but instead, he found himself drawn to this woman who seemed to understand his frustrations. I was blindsided. I felt a mix of anger and sorrow. He was looking for solace in someone else while I was right here, ready to support him through anything. We talked late into the night, both of us crying, feeling the weight of unspoken fears and insecurities. I expressed my hurt over the idea of him being with someone else, and he explained how he had let his guard down, thinking it was harmless. But it wasn't harmless. It was a betrayal of our trust. The next day, we ventured out for a hike, hoping the fresh air would help clear our heads. As we walked, I shared memories of our early days together, laughing about silly moments that made us fall in love. I could see a flicker of light in his eyes, a reminder of who we once were. But every step we took felt heavy with unresolved feelings. I realized how fragile our connection had become, and I wanted to fight for it. But just as I felt a glimmer of hope, something else happened. We stumbled upon a clearing where a group of people were having a picnic, and among them, I spotted a familiar face. It was the woman Jake had been texting. My heart sank, and I felt the world close in around me. Jake hadn't seen her yet, but I knew I had to act. I felt like I was losing control over my own life. I turned to Jake, who was still admiring the view, and said we should head back. He noticed my sudden change in demeanor and asked what was wrong. I didn't want to drag him into more drama, but I also couldn't hide the truth. I just don't feel comfortable here, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. On the way back, my mind raced. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Jake seemed oblivious to my turmoil, and I couldn't help but feel like I was losing him to this other woman. As we reached the cabin, I decided to confront him once and for all. That night, after a tense dinner filled with silence, I asked him point blank if he still had feelings for her. The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. He hesitated, his gaze drifting away, and I felt my heart pound in my chest. Finally, he admitted that he found her intriguing, but he insisted that his heart still belonged to me. I felt a surge of anger mixed with desperation. I told him that he needed to choose. He couldn't have one foot in this relationship and another with her. It was unfair to me, and it wasn't the life I wanted. I had to know if he was truly committed to us. He promised he would cut ties, but I couldn't shake the doubt. As we settled in for the night, I lay awake, unable to close my eyes. I kept replaying everything in my head. Could I really trust him to let go of this other woman? My heart was a battlefield, torn between love and hurt, and I didn't know how to move forward. Update 3. The next few days felt like an emotional roller coaster. I was on high alert, watching Jake's every move, trying to discern whether he was truly committed to repairing our relationship. He kept his phone close, and every time it buzzed, I felt a jolt of anxiety. Was it her? Had he reached out again? To regain some sense of control, I decided to focus on myself. I started journaling, pouring my feelings onto the pages, hoping to find clarity. I also reached out to a therapist, seeking guidance on how to navigate the mess we were in. The idea of having a third party help us seemed daunting, but I knew I needed support. As the days turned into a week, I watched Jake make an effort to be present. He took on more responsibilities with our son, and I noticed small changes in his demeanor. He seemed more attentive, more engaged. But there were still moments when I caught him lost in thought, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was because of her. One evening, I decided to go through Jake's phone again. I felt conflicted, but convinced myself it was for the best. As I scanned through his messages, I found a text thread with that woman. My heart raced as I read through the exchanges, and I felt like I was about to implode. They were discussing a project, but there were hints of flirtation, playful banter that made my blood boil. I confronted him, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. How could you still be talking to her? I thought you were done with this. He looked taken aback, as if he hadn't realized the extent of my pain. I thought I was just being friendly, he stammered, and I felt the rage boiling over. You promised me you would cut ties, I shot back, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to realization. That night, I made a decision that felt terrifying but necessary. I told Jake that we needed to separate for a while to figure out what we both wanted. He pleaded with me to reconsider, but I felt that taking space was the only way I could regain my sense of self. As I packed a bag, my heart was heavy. I didn't want to walk away from the life we built together, but I felt I had to stand up for myself. I left the house that night, unsure of where to go or what the future held. As I stayed with my parents, I felt a whirlwind of emotions: sadness, anger, and fear of the unknown. I missed Jake, but I also realized that I needed to prioritize my own well-being. Days turned into weeks, and I spent time reflecting on our relationship, seeking therapy, and finding new ways to cope. I began to understand my worth and the importance of mutual respect in a relationship. I communicated with Jake sporadically, and each time felt like a small step toward healing. One evening, I received a message from him. He asked if we could meet to talk. I was apprehensive but agreed. When we sat down, I saw a change in him. He looked more vulnerable, more aware of the impact of his actions. He expressed his deep regret for the pain he caused and shared that he had been working on himself, attending therapy, and realizing the depth of his feelings for me. It was a moment filled with hope, but I knew I had to be cautious. We spent hours talking, sharing our thoughts and feelings. I listened to him, weighing my options carefully. I wanted to believe he was sincere, but I also knew that trust was a fragile thing. After our conversation, I felt a glimmer of hope. We agreed to take things slow, to focus on rebuilding our connection without rushing into anything. It would take time, effort, and patience, but I felt we were finally on a path toward healing. As I returned home that night, I realized that love is not just about being together. It's also about being individuals who respect and support each other. I felt a renewed sense of determination to rebuild our life together, one step at a time. Thanks for reading, Reddit. I'll keep you updated as we navigate this journey.